In October of 1962, at an estate liquidation sale outside of Viroqua, Wisconsin, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Detweiler paid $900 for a loom shed that the Vernon County Bank had repossessed from the Aldrich family and put up for auction with everything still inside it. The auctioneer listed it the way a man lists something he expects nobody to want. He said there were 4 looms of various condition, some of them missing parts, one of them missing more than parts. He said there were shelves of pattern books and drafting notebooks, several 100 pounds of raw fleece in varying states of preparation, cone yarn on metal racks, a warping board, a bobbin winder, a skein winder, a rigid heddle that had been repaired twice with wire, a spinning wheel with a cracked whirl, and a building that was 12 by 24 feet, board and batten construction, with a wood stove, a concrete floor, and a roof he declined to characterize. He said the bank wanted to liquidate the contents as a single lot because separating them would cost more than they were worth. There were 11 people at that auction. 7 of them were there for the Aldrich farmland, which sold that same morning for $41 an acre. 2 of them were fiber arts dealers from La Crosse, who had driven down hoping to pick individual looms out of the lot for resale. One of them was a man from the county who collected old tools and had heard there might be a warping frame worth something. And one of them was Nora Detweiler, who had driven 40 minutes from her farm in Richland County in a truck with a flatbed trailer she had borrowed from her neighbor Glenn Haas, which should tell you something about how she arrived at that auction. The La Crosse dealers bid the lot to $400 and stopped. The tool collector bid it to $550 and stopped. Nora Detweiler bid it to $900, and nobody followed her. The dealer from La Crosse asked her what she planned to do with it. She said she planned to use it. He looked at the shed, looked at her, and said she'd paid about $700 too much. She thanked him for his opinion, backed the flatbed up to the shed door, and started loading. The story spread through Vernon County, the way all stories spread in small farming counties. From the estate sale to the feed store in Viroqua, from the feed store to the co-op, from the co-op to the diner on the main road, from the diner to the church parking lots on Sunday morning, picking up detail and commentary at every stop. By the time it reached the church, the version in circulation was that some Richland County woman had paid nearly $1,000 for a broken-down weaving shed full of junk the bank couldn't give away. People who had been at the auction confirmed this was more or less accurate and added that she had seemed perfectly calm about it, which made the story worse somehow. A calm woman paying too much for the wrong thing was more troubling than an excited one. Let me tell you about Nora Detweiler, because what she did with that loom shed and those pattern books only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to read what she was looking at. Nora was born in 1931 on a farm outside of Cazenovia in Richland County, Wisconsin, the second of 4 children and the only one who stayed. Her father, August Detweiler, was a man who had come to farming sideways through a decade of working as a textile mill mechanic in Sheboygan before his own father died and left him 80 acres and a decision to make. He took the 80 acres. He kept the mechanic's mind. He understood systems the way a man understands them when he has spent years watching them fail and figuring out why. And he applied that understanding to everything on the farm, to the equipment, to the soil, to the flock of Corriedale sheep he started building in the mid-1940s when he decided that a farm with a single income stream was a farm with a single point of failure. The sheep were the second income stream. The wool was the third. August Detweiler believed in redundancy the way some men believe in Scripture. He also believed in pattern, not pattern in the decorative sense, though he appreciated that too, but pattern in the structural sense. The idea that a thing had an underlying logic that could be read and reproduced and modified by someone who understood it. He had learned to weave from his mother, who had learned from hers, and he kept 2 4-shaft looms in a room off the back of the barn that he called the fiber room, which was not a shed, but was close enough in spirit that Nora would recognize the Aldrich building the moment she walked into it. He taught Nora to weave when she was 9 years old. Not the simplified version he might have taught a child he expected to lose interest. The full version, with threading drafts and tie-up sequences and treadling patterns, with the understanding that a weave structure was a kind of notation system, and that reading it was a skill with the same practical weight as reading a seed catalog or a soil test. By the time Nora was 14, she was reading pattern books the way other girls read novels, not for the finished images, but for the underlying structure, the threading sequences, the mathematical relationships between warp and weft that produced a given surface. August Detweiler noticed this and responded to it the way he responded to everything useful. He found her more books. He ordered them from university extension programs and textile guilds and the occasional estate sale. And by the time Nora was 20, the shelf in the fiber room held 64 volumes, some of them in German, some of them photocopied from originals too fragile to mail, some of them handwritten by weavers who had never expected anyone outside their immediate community to read them. Auguste died in the spring of 1958, a Tuesday in April, quickly and without much warning, the way men like him sometimes go, as though the body simply decided it had finished its work and stopped. He left Nora the farm, 83 acres by then, paid for, with a note in the deed box that said the mortgage had been retired in 1951. And she should keep it that way. He left her the fiber room and everything in it. He left her a savings account at the Richland Center Bank with $11,400 in it, which was not a fortune, but was not nothing, and which represented 20 years of August Detweiler selling wool and woven goods and equipment repairs and never spending what he didn't have to spend. Nora was 27 years old when she inherited that account, and those 83 acres, and those 64 pattern books, and she understood all 3 of them with the same clarity. She had not married. There had been a man briefly in the mid-1950s, a veterinarian from Boscobel, who had asked her twice and received 2 polite refusals, not because she disliked him, but because she had looked at what the marriage would require her to give up and decided the arithmetic didn't work. She had the farm. She had the fiber room. She had the books and the looms and the flock and the understanding of all of them that her father had spent 20 years building in her. She was not going to trade that for a house in town and a husband who would be kind about the weaving as long as it didn't take up too much room. By 1960, she had expanded the flock to 40 Corriedale ewes and was selling raw fleece to 3 buyers in the region, processed roving to 2 fiber art suppliers in Madison, and finished woven goods, primarily yardage for upholstery and home goods, to a small number of direct customers who had found her through word of mouth. Her income from the farm was modest. Her expenses were lower. She kept the ledger the way August had kept it, every dollar in and every dollar out, and she reviewed it every Sunday evening, the way other people reviewed the week's news, looking for patterns, looking for waste, looking for the places where the numbers told her something she needed to hear. Now, the loom shed. When Nora Detweiler walked into the Aldrich building on the morning of that October auction, she did not see what the La Crosse dealers saw. They saw a depreciated inventory of used equipment in mixed condition with uncertain resale value. She saw something else entirely, and she had seen it before, 6 weeks earlier on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. Let me tell you about that Tuesday, because this is where the story stops being about an auction and starts being about something that looks like impulse, but is actually the final step in a plan. In late August of 1962, Nora had driven to Viroqua on a routine supply run and had stopped on the way back at the Aldrich farm because she had heard through the Richland Center wool buyers that the Aldrich family was in financial difficulty and that Marta Aldrich, who had run the weaving operation for 22 years, was selling off what she could before the bank took the rest. Nora had met Marta Aldrich once at a fiber arts gathering in La Crosse in 1957 and had spent 40 minutes talking to her about a particular overshot weave structure that Marta had developed from a pattern in a German language book published in 1887. Nora had not forgotten that conversation or the name of the book. She spent 2 hours in the Aldrich shed that August afternoon. She went through the pattern books shelf by shelf. She counted them, 89 volumes, including 14 she had never seen outside of university library catalogs, including the 1887 German volume, and including 7 handwritten drafting notebooks in Marta Aldrich's own hand that documented 30 years of original pattern development and the technical modifications Marta had made to adapt historical structures to contemporary yarns and equipment. Nora sat on the concrete floor of that shed for 20 minutes with one of those notebooks open in her lap and understood that she was looking at something that had no price in the conventional sense because nobody else in Vernon County or possibly in the state of Wisconsin would know what it was worth. She also assessed the looms. 2 of the 4 were Macumber floor looms, 8 shaft, in serviceable condition with minor repairs needed. One was a smaller 4 shaft in poor condition but rebuildable. One was the loom the auctioneer would later decline to characterize, a large countermarch loom that had suffered water damage to its frame, but whose metal components, heddles, reed, and hardware were intact and valuable as parts. She noted the fleece, the cone yarn, the warping equipment. She did the arithmetic in her truck on the way home, on a piece of paper she kept in the glove box for exactly this kind of calculation. She figured the 2 Macumbers were worth $400 in working condition. The 4 shaft was worth $50 in parts. The countermarch hardware was worth $60 to the right buyer. The cone yarn on the racks was worth at minimum $120 at wholesale. The fleece was worth $40. The warping and auxiliary equipment was worth another $30. That was, by her count, $600 in recoverable value from the physical equipment and materials alone before she counted a single book. She did not try to count the books. She knew what the 1887 German volume would cost to acquire through a textile library or a specialty dealer. She knew what Marta Aldrich's handwritten notebooks would cost if anyone ever understood what they contained. She wrote the number $900 on the piece of paper, circled it, and drove home. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman pay too much for a broken-down shed full of used equipment. They were watching a woman pay a fair price for a library that didn't know it was a library yet. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Nora proved that knowing what something is worth and knowing what to do with it are the same skill when you have been taught correctly. She moved the shed contents to her farm in 3 trips over the course of a week, with Glenn Haas's flatbed and her own truck. She set the McCumbers up in the fiber room, which required rearranging her father's 2 looms to make space, and she spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but assessing and cleaning and cataloging. The pattern books went onto shelves she built herself from lumber she had on hand, rough-cut pine from a tree she'd had milled 3 years earlier for a different project. She built the shelves in 1 weekend. They ran the full length of the fiber room's east wall and held all 89 Aldrich volumes alongside her father's 64 153 volumes total, the largest private collection of weaving pattern books in Richland County, and possibly in the region, though Nora did not know this for certain and would not have said it if she had. The McCumbers needed new heddles on 2 of the 8 shafts, a replacement brake spring on 1, and a complete rethreading. Heddles, $4.60. Brake spring, $1.10, fabricated from stock at the Richland Center Hardware. Rethreading was her own labor, 2 evenings per loom, which she did not count as a cost because she would have done it anyway. The 4th shaft she stripped for parts and used the hardware to repair the rigid heddle and 2 of the auxiliary frames she had acquired with the lot. The countermarch loom she disassembled completely, sold the heddles and reed to a weaver in Madison for $45, and used the remaining frame lumber, which was white oak and structurally sound below the water-damaged sections, to build a warping frame that was larger and sturdier than the one she'd been using for 12 years. The cone yarn she sorted by fiber content and weight and integrated into her existing inventory. The raw fleece she processed through the fall, washing and carding it on the equipment she already owned, and it went into her roving supply without ceremony. Total additional cost for the physical rehabilitation of the Aldrich equipment, $41.30, not counting her own labor, not counting the lumber she had on hand. Total recoverable value from the physical equipment and materials realized over the following 18 months, $610, which was within $8 of her August estimate. That left the books. Nora spent the winter of 1962 into 1963 reading Marta Aldrich's notebooks the way her father had taught her to read pattern books, not for the finished surface, but for the underlying structure, for what the notation told her about the decisions that had been made and why. Marta had been working across 30 years of drafting notebooks on a systematic adaptation of historical overshot patterns to a particular weight of Corriedale wool, spun at a particular twist angle, which was, not coincidentally, the same breed Nora raised and the same preparation method she used. The notebooks were not a collection of patterns. They were a methodology. They were the documented record of one weaver's 30-year conversation with a technical problem, and Nora could read every word of it because August Detweiler had spent 20 years teaching her the language. By March of 1963, she had begun producing woven yardage, using Marta Aldrich's adapted structures with her own Corriedale fleece, processed to Marta's specifications, and the resulting cloth was different from anything she had produced before. It was heavier and more coherent, with the surface that held its structure through washing in a way that upholstery-weight fabric was supposed to, but rarely did. She sent a sample to her Madison supplier with a note explaining the weave structure. The supplier wrote back in 10 days and asked for as much as she could produce, at a price that was 30% above what Nora had been receiving for her standard yardage. She did not celebrate this. She noted it in the ledger and kept working. If you have ever watched a community decide something had no value and watched one person quietly prove them wrong over the course of a decade, stick with me. Because what happened in Richland County over the next 15 years is the part of this story that the people who laughed at the auction would spend the rest of their lives not quite being able to explain. Word about the yardage traveled slowly at first, the way accurate information travels in small communities, which is slower than wrong information and with less embellishment. A weaver in Spring Green heard about the cloth through the Madison supplier and drove to Nora's farm to see the looms. She stayed 4 hours. She came back the following month with 2 other weavers. By 1965, Nora was running informal workshops in the fiber room on Saturday mornings, not because she had planned to teach, but because people kept asking. And she had concluded that the methodology in Marta Aldrich's notebooks was too important to keep to herself. She charged $4 per session. She did not advertise. She kept a list of who had attended and what they had worked on, in the same ledger where she kept the farm accounts, because to Nora Detweiler, a workshop attendance record and a wool sales figure were the same category of information, evidence about what was working. By 1968, she had 40 regular students, a waiting list, and a reputation that had spread beyond Wisconsin into the upper Midwest fiber arts community. She raised her workshop fee to $8. She raised it again to $12 in 1971. She did not raise it beyond $12 for 6 years, not because the market wouldn't bear it, but because she had run the numbers on $12 per student per session, with 40 students and 2 sessions per month, was producing more income than she needed to keep the farm solvent, and she did not believe in charging more than the work required. The farm itself she ran the way August had run it. No debt, no equipment loans, no operating line of credit. When a piece of equipment needed replacing, she saved for it and bought it. When she needed a new loom, she built one. Twice, using plans she had adapted from a 19th century design in one of the Aldrich books and lumber she had cut from her own woodlot. The looms she built were not beautiful in the way a factory loom is beautiful. They were functional in the way her father's workbench had been functional, which meant they were exactly as good as they needed to be, and not $1 more elaborate. Her savings grew the way savings grow when expenses are low and income is steady. Without drama, without milestones, she bothered to mark, at a rate that would have seemed unremarkable in any individual year, and was quietly extraordinary across a decade. By 1974, she had $41,000 in the Richland Center Bank, the same bank where August's $11,000 had sat, in an account that bore his name until 1958, and hers afterward. She had expanded the farm to 97 acres, buying the adjacent 14 acres from a neighbor in 1969 for $62 an acre, paying cash, the neighbor's son having moved to Milwaukee, and the neighbor himself having decided he was done farming it. She had replaced the flock twice over, improving the bloodlines each time, and was selling raw fleece, processed roving, finished yardage, and workshop instruction, 4 income streams, the way August had always said a farm should run. The people who had laughed at the $900 auction bid had mostly stopped laughing by the mid-1960s, not because they understood what she had done, but because the results were visible and they were not sure how to account for them. The lacrosse dealer who had told her she'd paid $700 too much drove past her farm in 1967 and saw the addition she had put on the fiber room, board and batten to match the original, and did not stop. He told someone later that he supposed she had made it work. This was as close to acknowledgement as the county was going to offer, and Nora did not require anything closer. Let me tell you about what happened in 1974, because this is where the story stops being about weaving and starts being about what weaving had actually been building all along. You know what happened to small farms in the 1970s. You know about the commodity price swings and the interest rates that climbed through the late 1970s into the early 1980s until they reached 18% and stayed there long enough to ruin people who had done nothing wrong except believe that land values would keep rising and that a loan at 12% was manageable. You know about the farm crisis, about the auctions that were not estate liquidations but foreclosures, about the equipment sitting in yards with sheriff's sale notices on it, about the farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations, going to the bank, and then to the speculator, and then to someone from outside the county who didn't know the names of the fields. In Richland County between 1980 and 1986, 11 farms went to foreclosure. Nora knew the families on 9 of them. She had sold wool to 2 of them. She had bought hay from one of them in a dry summer when her own pasture was short. She watched what happened to them with the quiet sadness of someone who understands the mechanism and cannot stop it, who can see that the people losing their farms were not bad farmers, but were farmers who had borrowed at one interest rate and were being held to another who had been told by the Extension Service and the equipment dealers and the land-grant university and everyone else with a credential that expansion was the path to survival, and had believed it because the people saying it seemed to know something. Her own expenses in 1982 did not change. They could not change. There was nothing to cut. She had no operating loan, no equipment loan, no mortgage. Her input costs were her fleece preparation supplies, her loom maintenance materials, her utilities, her vehicle fuel, and the food she didn't grow herself. These were the same costs she had carried for 20 years. When the commodity markets moved against her, which they did, she had the workshop income. When the workshop income softened, which it did briefly in 1981 when 2 of her regular students left the county, she had the wool sales. The 4 streams August had preached did not all run low at the same time, and even when 3 of them were thin, the 4th kept the ledger positive. In the spring of 1983, the Halverson farm went to auction. 88 acres, the northwest corner of which shared a fence line with Nora's east pasture. She had known the Halverson family for 25 years. Dale Halverson had borrowed heavily in 1977 to buy a new tractor and a grain dryer and to expand his corn acreage on the advice of his lender and his dealer and the prevailing wisdom of the moment, which said that corn was going to stay above $3 and that land was going to keep appreciating, and that a man who didn't expand when he had the chance was a man who would be left behind. By 1983, corn was below $2.50. The interest on Dale's operating loan was at 16%, and the farm that his grandfather had broken from timber in 1911 was going to auction on a Thursday morning in April. Nora drove to that auction in the same truck she had driven to the Aldrich estate sale 21 years earlier. She had $67,400 in the Richland Center Bank. She had told no one this. The farm's opening bid was set at $45 an acre by the bank, which wanted to recover its loan balance and nothing more. There were 6 bidders, 2 land speculators from outside the county, a neighbor to the north of the Halverson property, a young man from Madison who had read something about farmland investment, and Nora Detweiler. The bidding went to $60 an acre, and the young man from Madison dropped out. It went to $68, and the neighbor to the north dropped out, shaking his head, saying it was more than the ground was worth in this market. It went to $72, and one of the speculators dropped out. The other speculator and Nora bid it to $81 an acre, which was 88 acres at $81, which was $7,128, and the speculator stopped at 80, and Nora bid 81, and the auctioneer called it. She wrote the check at the table they had set up outside the Halverson barn. She wrote it from the Richland Center account. The bank officer who took the check looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he expected to be one thing and finds is another. The people standing near the table went quiet in the particular way that a crowd goes quiet when it is rearranging what it thought it knew. Not applause, not commentary. The sound of a collective assumption revising itself in real time. Dale Halverson was standing at the edge of the barn. He had watched the bidding with his hands in his pockets, and his face arranged into the expression of a man who has already done his grieving and is now simply witnessing the official conclusion. When Nora walked past him after signing the papers, he said he was glad it was her and not the other one. She said she'd farm it right. He nodded. That was the whole conversation. The story traveled differently this time. Not from the feed store to the co-op to the diner with laughter and embellishment. From the auction to the co-op to the diner with something quieter. Something that sounded like people trying to work out how a woman who had been weaving cloth in a fiber room for 20 years had $7,000 in cash available on a Thursday morning in April, when the rest of the county was watching farms go to speculators. The answer, when people worked it out, was not satisfying in the way that easy answers are satisfying. It required them to reconsider a purchase they had laughed at in 1962, and a shed full of pattern books they had dismissed as junk, and a methodology they had not understood because they had not been taught to read it. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that August Detweiler would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora Detweiler farmed the combined property, 185 acres by 1991, when she bought the adjacent parcel that came available after another consolidation for the rest of her working life. The fiber room she expanded twice, once in 1975 to accommodate the growing workshop program, once in 1988 to house the 2 additional Macumbers she had acquired from a closing textile arts program at a college in Minnesota, paying $300 for both of them and spending 6 weekends restoring them to working condition. The Aldrich pattern books remained on the east wall shelf, alongside August's 64 volumes and the additional 31 she had acquired over the years, 217 volumes total by 1995, cataloged in a notebook she kept on the workbench in her father's handwriting style, which is to say precisely and without sentiment. She never married. She did not appear to regret this. She had the farm and the fiber room and the work, which was the same answer she had given the veterinarian from Boscobel in 1954, and which remained accurate 40 years later. Her niece Carol, the daughter of her younger brother Paul, began spending summers on the farm in 1979 when Carol was 14 years old. Carol had her great-grandfather August's way of looking at things, the mechanic's habit of seeing systems rather than surfaces, and Nora recognized it the way August had recognized it in her, and responded to it the same way, by teaching her everything, the full version, with threading drafts and tie-up sequences and the mathematical relationships between warp and weft, and the methodology in Marta Aldrich's notebooks, and the reason the ledger was kept the way it was kept, and what the numbers in it were actually saying. Carol took over the day-to-day farm management in 1994, and the workshop program in 1997. She is still running both. In the fall of 1989, the Richland County Fiber Arts Cooperative invited Nora to speak at their annual gathering. She was 58 years old. She stood at the front of a room that held 63 people, several of whom had been at the Aldrich auction in 1962, and she spoke for 11 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that she had been asked to talk about her career in weaving, and she wanted to say first that she did not think of it as a career in weaving. She thought of it as a farm that happened to include a fiber room, and that the distinction mattered because a career was something you could lose and a farm was something you owned. She said that the most important thing August Detweiler had taught her was not how to thread a loom, but how to read a pattern, and that a pattern was not just a weave structure, it was any system with an underlying logic that could be understood by someone who took the time to learn the notation. She said that the Aldrich shed had been full of patterns that nobody else at that auction knew how to read, and that she had paid $900 for them because she knew what they said, and that everything that had followed, the workshops, the yardage, the Halverson land, the 217 books on the east wall shelf, had followed from that one act of reading correctly. She said, "A pattern book is only worth something to someone who can read it. The same is true of a farm, a ledger, and a loom shed the bank couldn't give away." The room was quiet when she finished, not the uncomfortable quiet of a speech that has gone on too long, but the different quiet of a room full of people who have just heard something they will think about later, privately, when they are doing something else. The lacrosse dealer was not there. He had retired in 1981 and moved to Minnesota, but a woman who had been one of Nora's first Saturday morning students in 1965, when the fee was $4, and the fiber room still smelled like the Aldrich shed's concrete floor, and wood smoke, was sitting in the third row. She had driven from Madison for the occasion. When Nora finished, she was the first one to stand up, and she stood up without making a production of it, the way you stand when something is simply true, and you want to be on your feet when you say so. What do you see when you look at a loom shed the bank couldn't sell? Most people see depreciated equipment and a roof. The auctioneer declined to characterize. Nora Detweiler saw a library. She saw a methodology and 30 years of handwritten notebooks. She saw 89 volumes of notation in a language she had been taught to read before she was 10 years old, sitting on a shelf in a building the Vernon County Bank had priced at $900 because nobody had told them what was on those shelves. $900. A fiber room in Richland County. A woman who had been taught to read patterns by a man who understood that the most durable thing you can give a child is not a tool, but the ability to see what a tool is actually for. The loom shed nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood until the Thursday morning in April, when she wrote a check that the rest of the county couldn't have written, for land that had been in one family for 72 years, with money that had been accumulating in the same bank since before anyone thought to laugh at her. One workshop session, and one bolt of yardage, and one correctly read pattern at a time,